Okay, so cellular respiration has three main parts. Number one, glycolysis. Number two, the citric acid cycle. And number three includes oxidative phosphorylation, the electron transport chain, and chemiosmosis. So first we will go through glycolysis. So glycolysis begins with glucose as an input. And as glucose is inputted, the first stage of glycolysis is the energy investment phase, which includes the addition of two ATP molecules to glycolysis, and this gives off two ADP molecules and two phosphate groups. And then glycolysis continues to where 4 ADP and 4 phosphates are added, and then 4 ATP are produced, which is where the energy comes from in glycolysis. And another thing added in glycolysis is NAD+, has 4 electrons added to it, and the 4 hydrogen ions to carry the electrons, which gives off 2 NADH and 2 H+ molecules. And this also, at the very end, leaves us with 2 pyruvates and 2 water molecules. So glycolysis is something that occurs in the cytosol. This shows the breaking down of glucose to 2 molecules of pyruvate, which is then, it also has a net production of 2 ATP produced, and this pyruvate is then added into the next step of the cycle, which we will talk about in the next clip. Okay, so the next part of the cycle in cellular respiration is the citric acid cycle, which begins with the pyruvate that we got at the end of glycolysis, which is then oxidized and gives off a CO2. And this is a reoccurring step that happens throughout the citric acid cycle, where as it is oxidized, it will then reduce NAD+ to become NADH, which becomes an electron carrier, which we will learn about later in the electron transport chain. And this carbon group is then attached to CoA as it enters the citric acid cycle. And as the citric acid cycle continues, more CO2 is given off through redox reactions, and the same thing is given here as NAD+ is reduced to NADH. And there is also production of 2 ATP per glucose molecule in this step of cellular respiration. And as you can see, FADH2 is given off from FAD during the citric acid cycle also. And we will learn about where these molecules come into play later on in the electron transport chain. And just to clarify, acetyl CoA is this molecule right here, which is what is added into the citric acid cycle after it is transported into the mitochondria through active transport. And as it is oxidized, this is the molecule that will end up entering the citric acid cycle at the beginning of the cycle. Okay, this is the electron transport chain, and this is where the NADH and FADH2 we were talking about earlier goes to after the citric acid cycle. And here Basically, all that happens is electrons paired with protons, hydrogen ions, are pumped from the mitochondria matrix out into the inner membrane space. And all the idea of electron transport chain is to manage the release of energy from these molecules into something that the cell can use rather than just having it be in one big lump boom. It's kind of like driving your car, where if you just lit all of your gasoline on fire, it wouldn't really get you far at all. But by burning it in compressed pistons and using it and harnessing the energy, you can go a lot farther. And so all this does is, over a series of steps in protein complexes, the ions are pumped out of the mitochondria. And here we can see cytochrome and ubiquium. You don't really need to know that, but that's what the Q stands for. Q, it's a weird word to pronounce anyway. And where this will quickly be able to transport the electrons out into the inner membrane space, where they're involved in the creation of water by adding oxygen, which we get from the atmosphere, to the hydrogen ions and the electrons. Since oxygen is an electron acceptor, it creates this right here, But electron transport chain does not produce ATP directly. All it does is create manageable energy breaks that we will see in the next step, where the cell can produce ATP by using this energy. Alright, so here we have the process of chemiosmosis, and this crazy thing we see right here is called ATP synthase. And this is where all the magic happens. Yeah, this is where all the ATP is produced. I know, people, please get excited. So, all of the electrons that the electron transport chain has been transporting out of the mitochondria way back there have now come over here and are being pumped back in to the cell. And because they're going down their energy gradient, they're giving off energy, and by doing this, they spin a wheel inside the ATP synthase as they go down, and they spin this wheel again as they're connected by a rod. It's kind of like a mill, almost like a water mill they use for energy back in the day. But instead, it's using hydrogen ions to create ATP. And by the spinning of these catalytic knobs, it gives off the ability to catalyze the reaction to use ADP and a phosphate to form ATP. And you get 36 ATP out of all of this work, which is a lot more than you got out of the citric acid cycle or glycolysis. And the electron transport chain plus chemiosmosis is what makes up oxidative phosphorylation. It's a very long word. Give me a second. There it is. Oxidative phosphorylation. And that is where you're going to get the majority of your ATP from the glucose that you input into cellular respiration. So you might be wondering right now, asking to yourself, Jake, I'm a little confused. Where is all of this crazy stuff taking place? And well, I'm going to give you the answer. First, glycolysis, the first mode that we went through, this bad boy right here, takes place in the cytosol, which is outside of the mitochondria, and then the pyruvate, we'll just name it PY for now, is pushed into the mitochondria through the outer membrane, outer mitochondrial membrane right here. And then the citric acid takes place inside the mitochondria, and these electrons that are given off from glycolysis and through the citric acid cycle through NADH and FADH2 take place in they go into the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. which takes place in the cristae of the mitochondria. And to show you the final ATP of each thing, we get 2 from glycolysis, 2 from citric acid, and a correction from my last video, it's actually 32 or 34, somewhere in there, ATP molecules for every molecule of glucose that is inputted into cellular respiration, which gives you a grand total of 36 ATP molecules that the cell can use from one molecule of glucose in cellular respiration. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you respirate on a cellular level. So I'm sure you're all wondering now, well, what if I have no oxygen? Can I get any ATP? Yes, you can, but I wouldn't recommend it. So this type of cellular respiration is actually totally different. It is called fermentation, and it involves the process of glycolysis, which is where you take glucose, and by splitting up into pyruvate, you can form 2 ATP from this process. But instead of then inputting the pyruvate to citric acid, you can't do that since it has no oxygen. So you need to find a way to recycle these NADH molecules that are created from glycolysis into NAD plus molecules, which you can reuse in another cycle of glycolysis to create more ATP. But you don't have any oxygen to create water out of them, so instead the hydrogen is then added to pyruvate, which forms lactate, which creates lactic acid. Which, if you have ever ran a long distance before, you know that lactic acid is not good for your muscles, and that'll make you sore. And as you can see through this process, by taking one molecule of glucose, we can only form 2 ATP molecules, while through cellular respiration, we're able to form over 35. So this is a much less efficient way to go, but it is a way to still produce some ATP without having any oxygen to work with. And this whole process takes place in the cytoplasm, since it is glycolysis. And there you go.